As you mentioned at the beginning, you describe both painful failures and also moments of success across your career. So, were there specific turning points that helped you identify strategies for survival or resistance? So, looking back, what forms of solidarity or institutional support, if any, made a difference in sustaining your agency and voice?
I suppose I've had a number of what I call light bulb moments, where you think, oh my goodness. And I suppose, even though I was always, I would see myself as a hard worker, and in my teens, like I thought I'd like to become a professor. For no, in a way, I saw education as the way out, in all sorts of ways. But yet, for those 12 years, if you're on a contract, survival becomes the main game. You haven't time to think about success. You're too busy thinking, where's the next branch going to come from? Because for somebody like me to be out of work was unthinkable. Do you know? Um, I had come from a family which had been downwardly mobile. And so the idea that I'd go on the dole, it just wasn't, which is the Irish paid, if you're out of work, you get what's called the dole. That idea, unthinkable. So, in a way, as I say, the first 12 years, I was busy surviving, just managing to. I was also studying part time, did a master's, did a PhD part time. So, in a way, keeping working was the main thing. But then, I suppose my first light bulb moment was when I was working in what is now Southeastern Technological University, and I had an idea for a new course, and it was a good idea. It was a strategic idea, and I lined up what was the requirement at that time. I lined up a bunch of people, and we produced a prospectus for the course. It was for a degree in social work, and that was all grand, and it went to the head of the institution, and instead of backing me, he backed a male colleague who, at that stage, I had a PhD, I was starting to publish, and he backed a male colleague who had no PhD, no publications, but he did have footballing expertise. And I thought to myself, all my assumptions have been wrong. I had assumed that if I got educational qualifications, if I started to publish, if I had a good idea, strategic idea, which would benefit the institution, then it would be backed. So I thought that was a light bulb moment. I thought all my assumptions have been incorrect. I have to review all the things I have taken for granted. And in reviewing that, I talked to colleagues, friends, and I said, why? What am I missing? What is going on? Why wouldn't he back me? And I knew it was not simply me. I could see that there was something about the system I was missing. And colleague said to me, she said, look at yourself. She said, at that time, I was teaching and coordinating a national diploma in childcare. And she said, like, that area was seen as low status, had no prestige in the institution. She also said that at that time, because I was, as I say, a bit badass, I paid no attention to, I wasn't conventional in the way I dressed. So my favorite outfit, this was in the 80s, was a boiler suit with a leather jacket, which I had mended with black insulating tape. Now I was always clean, but and she said, soften your look. She said, smart casual, you just have to pay a bit more attention to that. So, in a way, she said, wear earrings, clip them on. I said, I've no time. She said, put them in the car, clip them on when you're driving. How hard can that be? But she said, I knew I could change the way I looked, right? She said, management will never take you seriously because they don't see the area you're in as serious. So no matter that I had PhD qualifications, etc., it made no difference to the way they would see me, they saw me. And she said it would be very difficult to change this. So I took it on board. It was a light bulb moment. I began to see the game was different to what I had always assumed it was. And I also realized that she was perceptive in that her observation that no matter how I change myself, their view of me was not going to change. So really, I needed to move. So I moved jobs. I got a job eventually in a university, in the University of Limerick. Um, and I started to take her advice, pay a bit more attention. The woman who had been there before me gave me some advice, and she said, try and find ways of making yourself visible to those people in power without it costing them any time. Now, the first challenge was to identify who had power. And I think this is, because I had kind of, like I did my PhD on women's friendships, I hadn't really paid any attention to power, even though I was a sociologist. But I had tried to kind of find ways around. So anyway, I identified who had power and I tried to follow her advice in terms of making myself visible to them without it costing them any time. So, what I used to do, and I used to feel it was so naff and so embarrassing, in that in the evenings I couldn't do it during the day, it seems so awful, right? I'd send basically just for information, article that if I had had an article recently published, I'd send that just for information. Of course, the man who was the most powerful, the president of the university, didn't read them, but they did pile up. He registered the fact that there was stuff coming in from me. So again, I was beginning to learn how the system worked. But I still had moments. So, for example, when I moved I had been involved as course director in childcare, then I was appointed a course director in women's studies in the University of Limerick, and these were predominantly female areas. And then, as I say, unexpectedly, I was backing another woman for dean, and she got a sabbatical, and so I decided to let my name go forward. I felt I had nothing to lose. I was well used to rejection at a professional level. And I said I'd stand as a voice for change. Well, to my absolute astonishment, I was appointed dean. And the first meeting was again one of those. I looked up the time, the date, whatever, went down. And when I went in the door, there were 30 people in the room and 28 of them were men. So there were two women apart from me. And my instinctive, visceral response was, I'm in the wrong place. And now I was confident. I've always been confident, although I'm fragile in all sorts of ways. But I thought my instinctive, visceral response was, I'm in the wrong place. I checked time, date, was right, venue, right. So I thought, I went in. It was a dreadful meeting. It seemed to me that there were only two roles on offer. One was the dutiful daughter, and I wasn't really fitting that and didn't fit it. The second was the harridan, and I didn't really want to fit that. So I came out after the meeting and I said to one of the two women who was there, I said, oh, I said, that was dreadful. What am I going to do? Right? I said, anyway, she was a younger woman than I, but more clued in. And she said, look to your supporters, she said. So that was a light bulb moment. She said, some people you will never convince. Just focus on those who support you. But then, like in a way, so these were light bulb moments along the way. But then I was appointed, as I say, I made this bionic leap from lecturer in the Irish system. It's like the British system, unlike the American, in that there are a whole load of steps, right? You go from lecturer, I was at lecturer for 25 years, basically, and to go senior lecturer, associate professor, professor. Well, a professorship was advertised. And it didn't say you had to be at the level below ASPRO to apply. So I was at lecturer level. So I thought, well, what have I to lose? So I applied. And to my absolute astonishment, I was promoted. And then I had a negative light bulb moment because I basically felt Now I had what I call the paperwork. I'd been publishing. I had PhD, you know. I had loads of teaching experience. I had been in academia for 27 years, but I suddenly thought, you know, I had an attack of imposter syndrome, and I realized I felt, you know, I can't do this. I don't know enough. Um, Now, I resolved that by my mother had unfulfilled ambitions and so academic ambitions. And so for 13 years, I funded a fellowship for two young students, not chosen by me on the basis of their Leaving Cert results. It's a totally objective exam, right, which all students go through. And so that, in a way, helped resolve, it reconciled the past, and it enabled me to get over the imposter syndrome. Interestingly, when I was appointed dean 3 years later, I had no imposter syndrome. I felt the dean's shoes are very small and I can manage those. They fit me fine, right? So in a way, so always there have been a series of moments, but the most important thing, moments of vulnerability, but also moments of clarity when I woke. But the most important thing is that I woke up to power.
Mm.
And I think that is something that many women, like I, until I was in my 40s, I chose to ignore that. And most women don't want to, for example, recognize the micropolitics that goes on in institutions. They want to feel they get there on their own merits objectively. That is not the way higher education institutions work. And so I learned that through these moments, excuse me, of failure, right? And I continue to have those moments of failure, right? Because having found that although I'd never had any time for management, I was actually good at it, you know. Um, I also found that I have never accepted, and this was a problem when I was not in a management position. I never expected I never believed that if somebody told me to do something, I should do it, you know. Well, if I think it's a good idea, I'll really work hard to do it. But just because someone said it. But when I was dean, that attitude was actually a strength because I didn't expect anyone to do anything just because I said it, because I wouldn't. So, in a way, what can be weaknesses in some contexts can become strength in others. And I also learned, perhaps one other lesson, I learned that, like, I had been course director in women's studies when most of the people who were teaching in women's studies were on part-time contracts, and where you had no backup. As dean, usually and typically a male dominated position. You have a secretary who runs your diary. You had a faculty manager. You had assistant deans. You had heads of department. You know, if you could tie your own shoelaces, you could be dean, you know, because there was so much support. So basically, getting a job which has previously been held by a man is a lot easier. And many women get deterred off those kinds of jobs because they think, you know, their senior positions, it would be so onerous. You know, there's so much support in terms of the amount of people you have helping you. Whereas as course director in women's studies, there was nobody. You know, like you were out on a branch and everybody was interested in cutting down that branch, you know. So I suppose the point I'm making here is that often we can psych ourselves out of positions because we feel they're too onerous and we don't actually recognize all the supports which are available. It's just, I suppose, by analogy, if you think of football, you know, the football managers, the coaches, the selectors, you look at all the people who are actually helping, you know. And so I found that there was a hard period of being dean when I was coming to the end of being dean because power was leaking away. But I mean, in a way, I had far less troubles than I had as course director in women's studies, which was just an additional responsibility. I also found that if you're in a position of formal authority, men do what you ask them for the most part, because the whole system runs on the assumption that men assume that they will occupy those positions in the fullness of time. Whereas I found what was disturbing and upsetting and disquieting, women pull away from power, that they feel that they're uncomfortable with it. They felt that I had gone over to the other side. It was much more difficult to retain. And this was coming from a position where I had basically been involved with women right across the university as course director in women's studies. So the key point here is that often senior positions are actually less onerous than those at lower levels, because there are much more supports.
So, yes, to conclude our interview, so your book speaks not only to your own life, of course, but also it resonates with many who experience the contradictions of being a feminist or a non-conforming woman in male-dominated institutions. So, what lessons from your experience would you consider essential for young academics, especially those engaging with equality, diversity, and inclusion initiatives from within academia?
Well, I suppose the first thing is to wake up to power. There's an echo on it. One sec. Can you hear me? There's an echo.
I'm hearing you well. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So the first thing and most important is to wake up to power. I mean, I say the book, I wrote it partly to save other women 15 years, because in a way, like, I didn't wake up until I was almost 40, which was really late, right? Okay. I suppose many women are very ambivalent about power, in that they see it as somehow something disreputable. Like, to me, power is about getting things done. And most women want to get things done, right? And in a way, if you have a small amount of power, any amount of power, then it's easier to get things done. And so having a very practical approach to things, I think, and changing your own, like, we are socialized into, not really wanting power, challenging that in yourself. The second and most important thing is even more basic. It is get a permanent position. Because obviously, if you are on contracts, it is very much more difficult to challenge things, because your position is not secure. You're terrified you're going to be basically sacked, let go, whatever. Now, how do you get a permanent position is, of course, a further challenge. Certainly, I think, other than in Sweden, Sweden, I think it may be okay, but certainly in Ireland, you want a male sponsor, not a mentor, a sponsor. Somebody who opens doors for you, who recommends you, who says to his colleagues, gosh, I've just this super person, I recommend her for sitting on a board for X, Y, or Z for profile. So, but the third point, which is very much apropos, is basically don't get bought, just because you have been promoted, you still need to retain the vision which you had before, you were promoted. Because otherwise, from the point of view of changing the system or feminist perspective, you're no asset at all, right? In fact, you're a liability, So, and I suppose I'd be particularly, I'm still doing what I call academic stuff, right? Okay. And I've been looking at Athena Swan, which is kind of in the UK and Ireland and Australia, Canada, Japan has become flavor of the month as a gender equality mark. It sometimes is regarded. But really, I've been looking at, in Ireland, we have no gold award-winning institutions, Athena Swan award-winning institutions. We have 4 silver award-winning institutions. And I've been looking at the successful applications of 2 of those 4. And let's say I am very unimpressed as depicted by those documents. They run to 180 to 20 pages, at their inability to really to call out gender inequality and to put in place serious measures to tackle it. So I suppose I'd be, and on the other hand, they consume a massive amount of principally young women's time, right? Putting those documents together. And they include both a description of the situation, mainly quantitative, and also action plans. Well, the action plans, the silver award-winning Irish action plans of 2 of the 4 silver award-winning institutions in Ireland. One would be tempted to say gender washing, is what is going on. So I would think be aware of the possibility that a lot of your time and energy may be consumed by exercises which are simply designed to derail your own career, to keep you busy, but which are actually going to do no good to you or to any other woman.